Hello everyone, today we talk again about the seigneurial system, looking at its spread and its essential function, especially through the imposition of a corvée, and therefore this strong individual dependence on the lord from the side of the peasantry, but also the necessity that this entailed, rather than being just some sort of a rigged system that couldn't produce otherwise. And in fact, dismantling what is already known today pretty well, historiographically, myth of the seigneurial system or manorial system. Now we see also how you may want to call it. It's essentially as just a survival rate production system, or just essentially a stagnating one, and which is definitely not true. And we made lots of videos at this point actually about the seigneurial system itself. We have already seen how essentially the economical revival of high medieval Europe is due essentially to the seigneurial system, or at least passes through it quite functionally. And what we consider as the main accomplishments of later, the most structured feudalism as it would form, or even the medieval urbanism and trade and so on, and production, etc., well, actually starts from here, and it always starts naturally in the countryside before then elsewhere, because that's really the place where stuff is produced, right? And you can't look at these civilizations thinking that we're growing just, because of the cities, right? The cities are dramatically important, but still there is this massive base that we can see at this point gets framed ever more into this kind of structured and kind of rational and systematic organization of its work, of its local work. This is in many ways the beginning of the Ancien Régime as we know it, and in fact it also takes different names. In the same French, it's known as the régime domanial. So even the same term regime is fundamentally spotted there. But it really couldn't be otherwise. So we have to understand really the base, that this really built up the base of what would be. And even in further developments, fundamentally it's always the same, because you can look at certain areas of Europe that had a major, urban development, became the richest. Think about Flanders, think about Italy, think about even certain areas of southern France, or the main rivers of Germany, etc. Well, those are massive developments, but behind that, and just next to that, and integrated in them as productive system, there is the seigneurial system still. Perfection, and at that time developed, consolidated in many ways, but it's essentially the same thing, right? And in fact, today we don't just we will not list the thing of the Dominicum, the Masseritum, and so on. That's the small little scheme that makes you understand how the curtis specifically, or villa, was organized. But it's actually more than that. It's realizing the expansion of this system beyond the same local base, and that fundamentally was born already beyond that, in a form of economical, but also political and social, naturally, organization that started from this area between essentially the Loire and the Rhine, in this greater Francia we can call, and that eventually was exported, what we will see today, in the rest of Europe. But these are all known things. The problem is getting them right in the right picture. So the seigneurial system, first of all, is this model of organization that emerged from a complexive movement of resources, and more than else of distribution of them, in a sense, or more than else who owned them, who controlled them, right? And to look at its origins, we also made a lot of videos, for example, about the Frankish commendatio, or even the origins in Gallo-Roman society from the Roman villa, essentially. There's a lot of continuity, as we will see, even lexically speaking, in Latin, how this was named, right? In different countries, the seigneurial system has actually different names. Everybody uses its own. In France, we've already seen it. It's the régime domanial. In Italian, it's Sistema Cortense. In Germany, it's Villikation Verfassung. In England, the manorial system. Every country had a bit of different history, and I promise I will get into technicalities of it in some dedicated video, because all of these regions have kind of different ways in which, different characteristics more than else, right? But the base was essentially the same, right? And it's based fundamentally on two elements that coexist as such. From one side, you have the bipartition of the farms, let's say, of these major farms and business, we can't call it, even looking even at the degree of production that was functionally directed not just for self-consumption but even for export. And here you have the different names. In France and Germany, this was usually called villa in Latin. In Italy, it was known as curtis. Manor in England instead. And this existed fundamentally in a sector of essentially direct control from the seigneurial perspective. Like the lord lived on the land, right? There was this patronal reserve, the dominicum in fact, or also known as sala or casa in Latin. So it's literally the land. Dominicum is the land of the dominus, of the lord. So sala means hall and casa means house. And then there is the indirect part, the massaricium, in fact, that is because the massari live there. And massari are simply the mansus, or mansid plural, workers, right? These are small familiar businesses of peasant character, fundamentally, known as mans, in fact, sortes, or case massarice. And there is, in fact, even if you look at these names, you understand there is not a pulverization of the concept of the individual peasant that just breaks his back uniquely on its tiny plot of land, right? This name as sortes, for example, it's like the consorteries of later times. I mean, it's this idea that there were, or case massarice, it's plural, right? It means that there were multiple farmers that were associated in this, always framed under a seigneurial control, but still being basically autonomous. And this is, we have seen it in other videos, how it had begun all very spontaneously. These guys were originally all freemen, and in many cases they still were, juridically speaking, ex jure, but they came to essentially grant ever more power, right, to entrust ever more power to this seigneurial lord that, for whichever reason, usually being more powerful, had the means, right, concentrated under his own control, right, to essentially provide, first of all, defense, right, order. The lords are effectively what are becoming the knights proper, the milites and their military retinues in this regard. So this speaks for the necessity of a that when you control your community from, let's say, the bottom of it, you can't even think about on your own. But when it takes to really control broader areas, you do need to entrust control to someone. Even the greatest libertarians are surely not against, police in the hands of a central direction. In case of emergencies, how wouldn't you like, your state to take care of coronavirus, for example? We all need, politically, socially, a degree of centralization in control, which automatically means you essentially lose part of your own personal freedom, but it's worth it, right? And it's negotiated, and naturally at the time, the process actually was very harsh. We are talking about a society, especially in post-Carolingian times, in crisis for many reasons, right? Either because the middle classes were being essentially exhausted by the continuous military expenses that were keeping to rise. The state had fundamentally fueled this concentration of power in an enormous amount of land in the hands of very few people, for the sake of the army, having this professional elite that could go there, could always be mobilized, right, in the empire, and of the second invasions, and of many reasons, right. But aside from the disruptive side of the story, that definitely brings probably for most of the coast from the essentially the early medieval freeman to the high medieval serf, let's put it in this way, indeed also and paradoxically in this sense, a spontaneous process. Like, these communities cannot defend them effectively anymore. They need someone who controls them. The problem is that central authority in this regard is theoretically still, the state theoretically still exists. There's always a public power, there's always a monarchy. Hell, there's even an empire, right? Every once in a while, at least, it disappears, but technically speaking, the rights of the publicum, as it was known at the time, were always there. Like the land, and this is especially important in in this broader area that had been part of the Carolingian Empire, in the sense that now it's complicated to discuss it, but if you stick, for example, just to Francia, right, the theory there was that fundamentally the king owned everything. Like, what pertained theoretically in ancient times to the Frankish people as such, de facto was just a private possession, and that's why. Now, we can't digress on all this, but let's say that in certain areas of Europe, and especially northern France, in this area of Benelux, fundamentally, northwestern Germany, and eventually during Carolingian times, in all those areas that were encompassed by the Carolingian domination, there is this brutally intense privatization of public power, right, in a way or another. In France, had basically always been like that. Especially in northern France, where there was the Frankish kingdom proper. Other areas, even in southern France, maintain a kind of more Gallo-Roman background, right? They were much more, they were very different, and this difference, in fact, would remain for a long time. Part still, you can argue today, but the point is really that there were certain areas of Europe that had a major, especially towards the Mediterranean, in fact, that had this major continuity with the idea of a strong public power, right? Even those kingdoms that eventually the Franks managed to encompass with Burgundy, even part of the Visigothic, formerly dominated Visigothic lands, the Longobarд kingdom, and these were essentially the most Romanized areas. Well, those had a decent and well-functioning, especially the Longobard kingdom, public power that, in fact, the Carolingians tend to preserve over time, right? Tend to incorporate, not to disrupt, right? But the Carolingian system, as such, functioned through the entrustment of power locally to the private clienteles of the king, of the sovereign, because technically the whole kingdom functioned like that. So it's obvious that the king had the larger amount of land and all. But as we know, there is this major crisis for which this point, especially these centuries we're discussing now, the video is not about a specific century, but we're talking essentially about the 10th. We gravitate around this. It's the moment of greater pulverization. Think about, in fact, the Western Frankish kingdom proper. So where this system had largely been born, because even Francia within itself had its own differences, like Austrasia in the east was actually much more characterized by kind of freemanship, we can say. Definitely it was a poorer area that had a lesser social stratification, hence the individual had more power theoretically, right? Because there weren't large clientele. There were even there, of course, but nothing comparison with the Western, let's say, the Neustria, as it was known at the time. But this model is victorious. Like, it's exported everywhere, and it basically works. Hell, it worked even in Saxony, where that was the furthermost area, probably of the whole empire. From that form of social stratification, there is the Standinger Revolt, for example. There are many there is a resistance from the side of the middle classes to the transformation, but they lose that. The Franks impose themselves violently with their model, but it's a successful model. It's the one from which effectively, and we know this, the revival of Europe began during the 10th century. So actually exactly the century of greater dispersion and disorder in theory, and of at least of greater destructure of situation of greater destructuration compared to even to the previous century in one way or another. So naturally you understand the implications here, but there is also the necessity of having a form of local government that can function, that can be effective, right? All these things form not just because someone was more powerful than the other, but because it was recognized that it was advantageous to be part of the system, right? You can't read this even just as a social thing, like a matter of struggle between classes. It doesn't fit the thing. There were many vertical divisions in this regard, and there were even very many shades of juridical dependence, but also of actual personal freedom. Sometimes there were serfs that had it better than freemen, right? If the discriminant was juridical at that point, well, sometimes serfs under the seigneurial, in the seigneurial regime, for example, had a much better life than freemen out there working on the lord's land by paying canons and corvées, etc., and therefore being de facto serfs, right? This is also another important step in the progressive framing of the rural populations under seigneurial control. But at this time, actually, rural populations still have, and this is very often forgotten, still have a great autonomy after all. Like the peasantry is very active. The peasantry has actually a lot of say in the development of these lordships, right? And there are naturally, in different places of Europe there are different situations. It's obvious that, for example, in the north of France you have a very precocious seigneurial control and expansion over their land, because it had always been like that. In other areas you don't have it. In Germany you don't have it. Even in certain areas of Italy, fundamentally, you don't have this immediately. You don't have it in southern France for a long time. There are very powerful lords, but the scale sometimes is very different from what you find from the core land of this, like North France, northeastern France, Benelux, etc. So, aside from the consensuality of in the establishment of these relations, we have naturally realized that there was this strong, very strong bond between the lord and the peasantry, right? And even economically between the Dominicum and the Massaricium, is very often represented also by this asymmetrical duty, fundamentally, for that is in disadvantageously shifted, of course, from the side of the peasants in general. The peasants of the Massaricium must provide these corvées on the lands of the Dominicum, right? Which means that they have to go work in the lord's land, in the lord's household, basically, territory, and for free. Right, and the reason why this happens, and they by the way, they are integrating in this point even the work of the slaves, the so-called servi prebendari, right, that instead lived within the Dominicum and regularly worked in there, right, that were in this sense maintained also literally by the lord, right, and think why at that point in time certain serfs had it better than freemen in this regard. Because naturally the lord had much greater interest in this core possessions of his, right? Sometimes the Massaricium was literally, external to the enemy, to the lordly household, and not just in the typical spatial sense, like with the center of the manor, and then all this territory, these plots of land scattered around. But we're talking sometimes even about very distant lands, in the middle of which there were other seigneuries, or as it often happened, that different communities actually had different contracts, let's say different relations with different lords at the same time. Certain seigneuries were even shared over same community. And it expands like that. Like even some of the largest seigneuries of the time, in Western Frankish lands especially, but also elsewhere, they do expand with this immense net of relations, of territories that were sometimes even hundreds of kilometers away. And that naturally gives you the idea that there was no, not everything was enforced, right? But at the same time, the necessity of paying the corvée shows you something else, that is essentially, I think, the necessity for cooperation, right? The corvée is not called just because so the lord can be richer and wealthier and having, a better life on his own, right? These seigneuries are constantly competing with one another. The communities that live under them are substantially threatened on a regular basis. So in a condition of emergency, you don't have to think. If you want to survive, you have to work hard, right? And probably these peasants recognized that at one point it was better to even back the local lord with their work, right? Even if it was unpaid, because in that sense it was still an investment for their own safety. Because if that lord had better, well, he could protect them, right? And it happened, right? So not the corvée in this regard are not like here, like the peasant will was reduced to zero because otherwise he would have been slaughtered anyway. Now, behind the corvée that are in this sense an unretributed performance, there is still the concept that, well, it depends. It's a political thing, right? You can't impose a corvée to a community that can still defend and that doesn't itself against the lord and has no interest at that point in backing that lord specifically. There is a limit in that naturally varies even for every seigneury, every relation, right? But it must be accounted in this regard, and therefore never be tricked by the juridical formality of this, right? Being a servus prebendarius, right, or being a freeman, a massarius, let's say, doesn't actually tell you, even historically speaking, if you were to make an inquiry in these sources, what the actual condition of these people were, right? If your lord provides you with room and board, the so-called prebenda in Latin, well, you're well off, right? You usually live within even an area that, I don't know, is fortified, for example, or at least is more directly protected by the enemy, from the enemies by the lord that lives just there, right? You're safer in general, and it's around these households that even lots of people of, in fact, unfree origin make a career over the generations, of course, becoming sometimes lords themselves, because it always happened, like literally always, that aside from the most typical thing, like, for example, how did viscounts were born? The title, eventually we know, in the feudal hierarchy crystallized at the end of the Middle Ages, it is the viscount. The viscount, by the 10th century, it's literally the vice comes, which means simply an administrator that is sent to, I don't know, maybe govern a castle on behalf of the lord. Well, maybe the lord dies, or he thinks of autonomizing himself, and he's there, and it becomes a small territorial lord on his own, and maybe maintains the title, and as viscount, right, literally, but sometimes there could be even just an enriched peasant, and there were here, right? Because don't think that seigneuries in this sense were just a matter of nobility. There were sometimes people that had nothing to do with the original nobility. They were merchants or just even peasants, farmers who had made money in the meanwhile, were actually managed to even marry, for example, the daughter of a lord. And why? Because they're rich. Maybe they offer themselves to pay even for the bride's dowry, which usually was a hell of an expense for her father. And they maybe even paid for the same marriage, and they would even pay for the dubbing of one of their maybe of the groom or their their male children when they eventually grew old, at their expenses, because maybe they had made money. And we know in the 10th century peasantry did in some cases. It's not the norm, right? It's definitely an exception, but these things did happen. This is also how this time the military class is still open, right? And this is the moment of formation proper, genesis of what we know as chivalry, right? And it's also not a dramatically documented period, but we know from all what we know that these things happen, right? From all the sources, these things happen and were essentially increasing the social order in this regard, because there was an integration essentially of all the elements that could really bring something into positive into the system itself. But it's deeper than this, because we see that the corvées that were owed by the majority of the peasantry in this regard, when they were called, usually in a condition of emergency, right? Which happened a lot. Think about famines, and if the harvest goes, well, what the hell do you do? You must provide these surplus in a way, and always being cautious not to squeeze too much the local resources. But for example, the Lord has unknowingly these stockpiles, these reserves that are very in terms of deterrent, they're a gun, because they can tell to the peasantry, look, if you're starving to death, if you're coming to raid your house, I have here the stuff you can eat to survive. Or you take refuge in here. So work for me, because you know that you also get increasingly part of the system. You can use of it. So, but what is important here is that the Lord still also needs this really to survive, right? Because the whole seigneury depends on him, and therefore with it also the fate of the rest of the communities, right? So this value that is represented especially by the Dominicum as such, is really at the base of the same seigneurial system, right? There could have not been. Toubert wrote this, and he's one of the greatest scholars that studied the 10th century, especially in the seigneurial system in itself, and etc., that there is no seigneurial system as such without the corvée. Right, there must be this enforcement of production, and because there is an acknowledgement from these lords that that's effectively the best way to make the system work. It's not just about treasuring stuff. This doesn't happen. Stuff wasn't treasured. Normally, they had all these products normally went redistributed on the territory. Right, this is widely known that all the development of medieval Europe does pass through this, because there were even infrastructures being built. How do you build an infrastructure that is connected with all the others if you're just an average peasant? Yeah, you can create a community with other peasants, right? You can, but you also need greater coordination, and normally these communities do not have. They do not come to acquire. Largely, there are other factors as well. I mean, you also have to understand which areas of Europe this happen, in which measure. But still, the fact that the seigneurial system spreads basically everywhere is very meaningful. By the way, there are similar dynamics even in those areas where the Franks haven't spread, right? The same England, actually, even before the Norman invasion. Of course, it had basically the same thing. These were societies that were going all towards more or less that direction, right? After a period of stagnation for just a couple of centuries in the beginning of the Middle Ages, you realize these guys are growing, but they grow from the bottom with this great political pulverization, let's say, for which every lord still basically centralized power at local scale, just to struggle with other powers all around. And in order to do this, the local communities had to necessarily take a side and support one side or the other. And it's also more complicated than this, because what you see in general is that the more developed areas tend to have a greater, if not social stratification, but at least diversification. Like a world where there are just free peasants, like certain areas, you can think, I don't know, Finland, even in the early modern time, are still some of the least developed in this sense. Civilization is happening somewhere else. And it passes, yes, through this apparent loss of freedom, but also through the development of the whole society, in fact, as a whole. So this is also a topic that can't sound surprising and thought-provoking, but if you think about it, it's really like this. Not completely, because still there are different formulas, right? There are different political models that do vary, in fact, largely in these countries, that evolving on the base of different lines. So you can see that even political fragmentation on the long run is not such a bad thing in absolute terms, but there still must be a net of communication that generally the average peasantry cannot control by itself, or maybe that is not allowed to control, but that it could have been capable of, just if it hadn't been peasantry anymore, it had become something else, right? Like a urban class, for example. So naturally, miracles do not happen at this time. There is not a sudden, brutal political and social change. These transformations on the long run happen throughout centuries. So at the time, they probably didn't fully realize what was going on, if not in those lands that had all of a sudden been invaded by this new model, right, which happened in Germany, in Italy. Yes, you see this even in the sources, but probably in France nobody really realized this was going on, or at least they were more used to already this being part of someone's clientele, well, of an aristocratic clientele, literally since Roman times, right? And this precondition is very important to understand Frankish history in the first place, because the Franks were very clever, or at least the Merovingians particularly, to create evidently a great continuity between the Roman latifundium and their Germanic lordship, right? They were actually the same people. At that point was a Germano-Gallic Roman society, whatever I don't know you want to call it, right? And what else can we say here? Well, about the concept of the connection proper, I think it's important. I mean, the seigneurial system begins to get fixed fundamentally for the first time in the royal and abbatial courts located between the Loire and the Rhine rivers, right? So this major fertile Atlantic plain that wasn't terribly developed at the time, but had seen this major boost given, in fact, starting since Carolingian times, to expand, right? It kept expanding. Royal courts means different things in the sense that originally, that there wasn't quite a capital in these lands, even during Frankish times proper, Merovingian and Carolingian times. There were several courts, different centers, even cities actually, and these already formed a net, right, that gets supported and increased by the founding of abbeys. There were also great territorial seigneuries, right, and therefore this area begins to set itself in motion like a sort of great engine, right, that eventually emanates this model also elsewhere. They have an amazing expansive capacity. So at the increase of the development of the exploitation contributed also the necessity from the side of the great royal and abbatial administrators to redistribute the reserves among properties that were very far from them. This is very important, right? Because it is true, this starts really at old levels of politics and society, but as we were saying before, there is never the end of the elite here. It's not that the Carolingian Empire finished, hence the whole political system crumbled, all the elites all fell. No, there was no an atomic bomb coming, raising everything to the ground. We're essentially the same people, still revolving around a monarchic center, and therefore framed into a series of relation of very high order, right, that controlled very vast territories, sometimes just nominally, but still at the point of needing contact with them, also at proving their own, legitimizing their own authority by proving they could interact with them, right? Because paradoxically, crises like, I don't know, the Viking invasions, the hunger invasions, etc., did help central power, right? Because the local communities were aware of what the local lords were doing. Instead of continuing to serve the king but just autonomizing themselves, they took the chance of these devastations brought up by these foreign enemies to say, king, look here, the guys that are here in theory on your behalf, in your name, they're actually unfit for even protecting us, which is literally the first duty they have, right? So we keep taking you as a point of reference in the process. This is what probably saved literally the Western Frankish kingdom, that if you look at other kingdoms of post-Carolingian times, was probably the least favored to remain in place, right? Or at least maybe the second least, but there were times in which even the Burgundian kingdom could survive to the French one, right? Instead, history took different paths, and part of the reason was exactly also, well, of course, the availability of resources in loco. You think about the Ile-de-France, all the enormous amount of strictly agricultural power. That's where it starts from always. That allows essentially what this time. How do you control a territory? With having military retinues, right? You have a lot of agricultural resources. You can pay soldiers. You can pay. You can maintain knights, right? And you can make them fight in a lot of other places. At that point, it's really a matter of who's the stronger, not just really because politically speaking, the world picture is a mess. But this is a world that, yeah, the was full of castles. This is the Seigneurial castellation proper. That is also something very spontaneously happened. Really, the second invasions have a relative small influence in phenomenon in castellation. It's really about the local lords building castles on their own to control the local peasantry. First and foremost, it's not much of reason of foreign threat per se. We see it easily from archaeology, telling the truth, because the emergential castles built during time invasions were usually abandoned afterwards, while the others were built in certain locations and areas that were remaining there and just aiming at controlling the local peasantry, not defending it. That's a different thing. Obviously, it was both in some way, in many ways, but that's also another. And we made some videos on encapsulation. I sent you there if you're interested. this stuff is all in the medieval society playlist, so it's fairly easy to find. But it's obvious that this is also kind of a lawless world. So where if you have the means, you can pierce through sometimes several seniors at a time. If you have really a major clientele of knights, etc., you can really do a lot of things. So it's also really a very violent time, very violent world, and that's what triggers, in turn, once again, over and over again, this need for sticking to your own lord. Because it's like there are wolves out there, that there is not much else you can do after all. So it's better to be a serf under a lord than being a corpse, right, and leaving your wife to be raped and your children to be slaughtered, right? And that's a serious reason for which you would accept to lose your freedom, right? And sadly, bitterly, this is how it happened. But as I tried to make you understand before, there's also the bright side of it. This is once again a century of growth, and this is very promising and explains much of the further development, right? As I often say, we're rediscovering for the revival of European economy and demographics, not much the 11th century as we were used to do, because we found out that by the 11th century we have just more sources about a lot of things were going on, but these were already so developed that you realize that the whole thing had started massively the century before. The 10th century, the Iron Century, the century of second invasions, etc., is actually the moment of the greatest, the real moment of revival of the European world. And this was a system under pressure. So just think about that. And probably this pressure also helped, probably catalyzed the process of growth, because by centralizing power in the hands of fewer people, this also allowed a more rational organization of the local resources that really smaller communities cannot do, and that they would have succumbed to invasions, to other factors. And this part is very serious, because the lords are often seen as the guys who just ruled over this peasants that starved to death. No, it was especially at this time, was really a very, very mutual relation aimed at survival. And there is a logic in an intelligence in a lord that is higher than the one of a peasant, right? It's really, it's true, this was a culture that, even militarily speaking, was still dominated surely by individualism. Like, think about how much contempt this lords had for monarchic power in the first place, that would come to control theirs, but at the same time they're imposing their power on the peasantry. And in order to do that, they need organization, they need to think through things, they need to be efficient and effective, and we know they were, right? As we were saying before, most of all these resources levied through the corvée were redistributed, because keeping them just in stock, unless we're not talking about the actual reserves that you must have where you're under siege and you don't have food, you're deprived of the surrounding agricultural world that also gets disrupted and so on. It was a very dramatic situation. Well, still in peacetime, which you can't really say that this was a peacetime in the first place, but in those moments of major, say there weren't major wars, invasions, and disruptions. Well, the seigneuries worked to reinvest constantly on the territory, and naturally they do it at their own advantage, right? Everything they built, as we'll see now with the mills or the beer productions, stuff like that, was all the ovens, etc. Were all like, I'm the lord, I built them, therefore whoever wants to use them has to pay a toll to me. And it was full of tolls. This is stuff that remained in Europe up to the 19th century, right? Every place had its own small, toll. Think about even the international trade, how was partly suffering from it, yet it was still developing, even that one, right? But this means that there were local powers that were able to draw resources in this way and to structure them on the territory, right? In turning them into, in fact, infrastructures, castles, roads, bridges, right? What even the royal authority was really interested in at this time was the control of bridges, of roads, of the communication system. That was probably the single most important thing. The first thing, I don't know, if you look at the Carolingian capitularies, when the Franks conquer the Longobard kingdom, the first thing they want to know from the locals is, we want to know how you were used here to upkeep the local bridges, the street, the roads, etc. Because you need to do that again, and we must know, and we must survey that, because that was fundamental for making armies crossing rivers and everything. So it was very, very important. And in fact, even previous legislations were quite concerned about these problems as well. There was also a system of policing, for example. Here the local, like the lord's retinues, it's not just the guys that go to fight against other lords. These are really policemen, fundamentally. They tour around. I mean, of course, even the same local communities had their own militias, their own control of the territory. Think about a world that it is also very beautiful if you think about it, fascinating, where everything is really taken care of very carefully, right? Lakes, forests. There was a great care about keeping these resources functional, active, useful for the local management. There was also a series of pre-existing laws, in fact, where there were conflictual, for example, renowning the woods and were a public good most of the time, or at least that's where the royal authority tends to concentrate itself, because those were dramatically important for resources, and there were certain spaces that the communities were called to really take care of, like a very important duty. So lots of things happening really in the 10th century, but the importance is really this idea of progressive structuring on the territory, really on a territorial base. This chapter of history has been studied a lot, naturally, by structuralist historiographers like the one of Les Annales, for instance. They had a markedly kind of socio-economical aim, right? Of these are kind of Marxian inspired historiographers, etc. They had their limits, of course, as such, but they were very important to objectively show that in a time like this, where there's not an enormous deal of international trade, where everything is very local, and everything effectively is built upon land, right? And land territorially meant that you need to control in one way or another. So it's all very ground, it's all very concrete, very material sometimes. There is still a small monetary circulation, for example, but this is also the same system from which this thing starts growing once again. Another aspect that, especially in the larger, why the seigneurial system at this point is also so very, it intensifies so much also by itself in certain regions, is because especially where there were the larger dominations, the Lord had to provide essentially for all the communities, right? So not all the local businesses, farms, etc. Produced the goods that they needed. So this brought in turn to the intensification of the exchange of the surplus, for example, both within the same great courts or also towards the external, right? And it's at this point that there is a curious, interesting, also kind of a known phenomenon, at least for those who study these things, that is the the birth also of the mercantile, certain mercantile figures that in this northern eastern French and Benelux areas are represented by the Saxon and Frisian merchants, right? These were people literally coming from Saxony and Frisia, and that were involved, in fact, in the export, the commerce of the agricultural surplus, to which they contributed importantly. And who were these people? Like, Frisia and Saxony were historically, as you know, not particularly developed areas. Yet they had been incorporated in the Frankish system, and they were slowly participating to the economical activities of this greater now Francicized area. These were in all likelihood enriched peasants, right? Small owners that, considering this new economical revival, had managed to invest part of their resources in trade. It's probably not so surprising that this figure emerges from two regions that had a fairly low social stratification, so in which probably, entrepreneurially speaking, they were freer, right? We have made that video, for example, about the Lotharingian knights, the Flemish and Lotharingian ministeriales. Actually, during this time, you see there that there is a lower social stratification. These people on average are, well, okay, the two areas actually are not an excellent example of that, because they're kind of similar to France still. But especially in Saxony and Frisia as such, well, these were areas where the peasantry had a kind of a larger freedom overall, a larger autonomy at least, in which probably small business was more widespread than in other areas, right? So that these guys could come to be the actual economical operators on behalf of the aristocracies that, of course, did exist as well, but more easily and more independently. And always talking about these peripheral lands of the Frankish world, right, what had been the Carolingian Empire, we notice, for example, the eastern borders, right, where urbanization had never quite existed as such, but there are all these small centers, definitely smaller of a city, that are essentially commercial centers. They're markets, right? They are born as markets. Eventually they would develop during the centuries in something larger, that are especially located around the North Sea, fundamentally, where this major, as you know, maritime activity now was pretty active, right? The second invasions had not finished these areas, especially on the on the North Sea proper, had even suffered from it, but had also structured itself in a way that could trade simply with the Vikings, for example, with Scandinavia. And now that was making a fortune. This is true actually also in Germany proper, is also towards the Danubian frontier in southeast. All this reactivation, let's say, after centuries, that is proven, for example, by the appearance of exchanges of silver coins that also are typical, not of a, of luxury, major transcontinental luxury products like it was typical in some ways, but of kind of middle classes, we can say, that are making a living around trade, commerce, etc. This is particularly important because the proximity, this is all connected in Northern Europe to, in fact, the Francia proper, where the seigneurial system is developed. This massively, let's say, privatized area that is getting specialized, in fact, in this form of management of land exploitation, etc. That spreads also in here. They produced, the Rhine, they produced swords, there was also slavery at this point going on, but this is a very interesting part of European history, because for the first time there is a new autonomous commercial center that gravitates around the northern European area, right? Like before, it had always been fundamentally around the Mediterranean, and everything was about the Mediterranean. This goes on, this continues, because the Mediterranean is still more important for volume of traffics, and even for the same connections that are starting being formed between, even with the north, right? But the speed, in relative terms, that it took for this northern area to develop is very meaningful. This thing survives to the collapse of the Carolingian Empire. This is also very meaningful. I made a video which is, I think, monasteries as connective tissue of medieval Europe, right? That's not really about the trade part of the story, but it's objectively the realization that the Carolingian system had triggered now had essentially started a process that was not ending with the empire in itself. And that was based on the realization there was a major system that still was thinking of being framed under the empire at this point, right? That's the real thing. There was a public authority of some kind. It was regulating this. There were monarchies that were on the continent definitely more developed, even the ones in Britain, in Scandinavia, right? So there is that becomes a pole of attraction, in fact, for the same Northern Europe that gets kind of sucked in, economically speaking, to this system. And it's very, very, very important. Looking south instead, for example, in Italy, the seigneurial system started fundamentally with the Frankish conquest of 774, right? There are many changes that Carolingian conquests trigger in Italy, and overall, the most evident one is, in fact, the increase of social stratification. The Longobards kingdom was a kingdom of cities. It had a functional juridical system it was very advanced, and it was the peninsula itself was well exposed to Mediterranean traffics, of course, so it was fertile. And the seigneurial system is important chiefly in the north. Lombardy and northern France, in fact, are usually dealt with historically with the most advanced and also the most productive areas for that reason. And I think for different reasons, were very important characteristics. I made a video about this, but I don't remember which one it is. It's one of the many I made about the seigneurial system, if you're interested in it. But it's evident also from a political and social point of view that Italy is changing towards kind of the Frankish model. Italy will never have this, let's say, overwhelming seigneurial structure that, I don't know, in places like France will give the rise to this massive seigneury. Think about the county of Champagne, for example, or even the Duchy of Normandy in its own regard, Burgundy. The French Burgundian part, not the Kingdom of Arles in the south, that will become massive things. Italy has something similar, right? But it's relying mostly on a trade base. So this eventually, especially during the 11th century, will bring to a crisis of the feudal system proper. Like Italy will remain essentially Francicized and feudalized area, but the rise of cities, as we know, will take over even the rural lords, right? At one point, the Italian communes will manage to even become lords of the typical seigneurial lords of the countryside, right? Which in countries like France or Germany was completely unbelievable, right? Unbelievable. But indeed, there is an important social certification. The Frankish conquest definitely hadn't been a particularly healthy thing for Longobard society, and there is a progressive, development of lordships, very often both rural and lordly, and urban. Especially during the 10th century under Ottonian domination, the bishop counts will have a great importance in that regard. The base is always the land, right, outside the city, of course. But still, there is a much heavier reliance um, on trade as such. Castles, just to make an example, are built. The Hungarian invasions in Po Valley were a thing at the time, but you would think castles were built just for defending. Well, there were people who actually built castles just to sell them. Like, it had become a business at that time, in a market, right? That in Po Valley was very developed because it basically was connecting the Mediterranean with that northern area we have been talking about. That really was fluidifying everything, with the major rise of monetary economy. So it's very, very different. There is a much more secularized thinking, even relative to the nobility. There is a urban aristocracy that dates back even sometimes to literally Roman times. It's all very, very different from the north. However, even in here, we realized that since the late 8th century, the corvées are present, right? Not just in the big companies, like in the great businesses, like it had happened, telling the truth, already in Longobards times, right? But also in all the other cortes, as were known there. So the manors. This is very important to realize, because also the Longobards kingdom had seen the rise towards the very last time of privatization, of this kind of progressive creation of clienteles, very similarly to what was happening in Anglo-Saxon England, right? These are two countries that had similarities in that regard, and that, however, crumbled when the Frankish model arrives, because, yeah, the people were kind of better off by certain standards than in France, because, the average peasant had it worse, right? But they can't oppose to the to the Normans for Britain, of course, and the Franks earlier for Italy, an equally effective professional army like the Carolingians had built. So that explains a lot why the systems crumbled, and they both actually showed some capacity of resistance, right? And they didn't just fall. There was also difficulty to even control them, right? This happened at 300 years of distance, but histories are not that different after all. But you realize that in both places the Frankish system survives, albeit, lives on, and gets empowered progressively, but still with certain particular characteristics that eventually will tend to make these systems taking another turn, at least especially for Italy. But what you see here in Italy is that, just like in France, the seigneurial system was accompanied by the let's say, a redistribution of the surplus, and therefore by a major presence of exchange economy, both internally and externally. In Italy, this presence had certain particular characters. Among these, the imposition to the peasants of certain taxes, consisting basically in the artisanal, to be paid in artisanal products, right? We're talking about agricultural tools, silk that was present there since the 6th century, the minium, that is the red lead, I think it's called, and this remained, however, still within the context of the Dominicum, even in here, right? But sometimes these products were sold outside the business, outside of the seigneury itself, and the movement of goods and products was also in here determined by the specialization of some of the cortes, and therefore by the necessity to import what they produced. For example, oil, salt, iron, right? There were certain regions here that were getting specialized even in these productions. And compared to the continental regions, however, Italy had particular characteristics, especially starting from the 10th century, which is the presence of castles and of cities of Roman tradition that affirmed themselves more properly as market centers, and therefore also of production of wealth to reinvest on the land, right? This is very, very important, because here it's really the city that makes the difference, right? In the north, there are cities, but especially in France, but they are not like in the Mediterranean, right? Here, the thing is quite different. The city is effectively the center of public power, whichever it is, even sometimes on a small scale, because there were also many cities, by the way. But that's always the same thing. It's the center of law, of power, and in the 10th century is further enhanced, as we were saying before. Even the Ottonians, when they come in Italy, the first thing they do is controlling them through the cities. And that's why they appointed the so-called bishop counts, because they were essentially trying to confer the comital authority to bishops, rather than the territorial lords, the properly Italic, in fact, lay aristocracy that didn't want the Ottonians there, right? And that sometimes was also growing to be very powerful. About the Canossa family would evolve during the 11th century, an enormous power. Enormous, but their territory stretched from southern Tuscany to the Alps. It was an enormous thing, but at the same time, it kind of vanished, because evidently at a local level there were other communities starting from the cities that were becoming always more autonomous, and that the rural lords hadn't the capacity to exclude from, let's say, they were not really counterposed specifically, especially in later times, but at that point it was really the city attracting lords rather than the lords being able to frame the city under their control, which is a very different thing. And this has started exactly because the Italian cities were the center of a major continental, or actually intercontinental traffic now, that passed through their city markets. And this enormous wealth that eventually will accumulate especially in the following centuries, and that will change a big deal of things historically for Europe, not only. So that's the important difference. Like the North has its center in the rural seigneurial proper. France, Germany have it's all about the rural lords. They have cities. There are cities, hell, even in Germany there are cities, but these do not have a city district on their own. Like outside of city wall, it's the lord that rules, right? And in the south, so I mean, in the north, it's really the rural perspective that counts more than else. It's all about the countryside. In the south, it's not. In the south, it's the city, and especially in the Italic kingdom as such. And there is a debate around essentially the remunerativity, the Reddit of the seigneurial system as such, right? There is been the prevalence chiefly in the past of what Toubert has called like a minimalist hypothesis, was based essentially on the idea that the production of the cortes, of the villa, was on fairly low levels, actually very low levels, and the supporters of this hypothesis, we're talking essentially about Perrois and Bucher, were observing in first place that the period of the affirmation of the cortes and villa had fundamentally overlapped with a moment of demographic stagnation, and that and furthermore, the weight of the money cannons that had to be paid was fundamentally scarce, right? Today, historians have a different idea regarding to this. From one side, they admit that the cortes privileged always, firstly, an objective of self-sufficiency, which is true. In fact, that was aimed naturally to satisfy the immediate needs of the producers, right? And at the time, yes, like there was complexively a low level of growth rate, right? But they redimension, especially the demographic crisis, right? And they especially insist instead on the economical dynamism that characterized the centuries of the seigneurial system between the 8th and the 10th century, right? So in this age, as you know, started seeing a major increase of works of like deforestation, reclamation, colonization, both in areas that would eventually give birth to new cortes, right? Both in areas were actually next to already existing cortes, and finally, for reasons that are more properly economical, we think essentially that this seigneurial system was very remunerative and that it allowed important stocking of wealth, especially. And supporters of the so-called minimalist hypothesis have generally not considered that next to the land revenues strictly meant, so we're talking about the cans both in money and in nature, that the researchers of the last years have pointed out to be not at all symbolic, like they were consistent things, right? The landowners, the lords in general, managed to spot other ways to draw resources to increase production, essentially. A form was economic investment, for example, in the construction of complex technologically advanced structures for the time, for example, the water mills, right? And also the production of beer in certain regions of Northern Europe, and that the owners basically managed directly getting a lot of profits from them. It's what we were talking about before in terms of infrastructures. I mean that all what was accumulated was enough to start activities with infrastructures that had not existed before, in that it was the seigneurial system that put there, right? Exercising naturally a monopoly on them. This was the lords' infrastructures, but there were people working there, and yeah, some through corvée, but others actually making a living out of them. And also think about building them. You know, the lords had to take resources from somewhere, so there was a market even for building these structures, etc. So that's not the picture of an economically static or stagnating world where it was just about, you know, surplus, survival rates. No, there was more than that already. And then there is another sign of the will of bettering of the business productivity from the side of the owners, which is the gradual reduction of the reserve at the advantage of the mansi. This is very, very important, because basically here you see that the seigneuries were confident enough to invest on territories that were not just within the confines, the borders of their own household, but that started looking at a broader horizon, right? And this phenomenon is observable in Italy as early as the 9th century, and it constitutes the signal in turn of two distinct movements. From one side, we see that there is a demographic development that rendered necessary, first of all, the obvious expansion of arable land, and therefore of the creation of of areas for of working areas for the new families. Right, these people were growing, they needed to expand spatially. So the seigneurial system couldn't remain rooted just around the lord's household, and you know that in fact major seigneuries at this point had tens of castles, even more. By castle we mean naturally something very, motte and bailey, something like that. From the other side, you find the will, the seigneurial will, especially to optimize the revenue of the business by reducing the dominicum, and that naturally couldn't satisfy all the economical needs, right? Some speak of technological backwardness, but it has nothing to do with that. We are here talking literally about the dimensions of how large these seigneuries were, territorially speaking, how many people they encompassed, how many communities, how much land and infrastructures, right? And from the other side, obtaining more wealth out of indirect management that was in this sense entrusted to the entrepreneuriality of peasant families. This is normal in a world where definitely you don't have many means of material coercion, right? You don't have machine guns to oblige entire areas to be under your control. You have literally to go there on horseback with your armor and sword to enforce your authority. But the same expansion of the seigneurial boundaries, we can say, is actually telling us that in fact it was the same seigneurial power that was capable of controlling this wider territory, because it was already more powerful in its own. So it had a higher level of deterrence, and these were small territorial states fundamentally were being developed through this system very gradually, right? So we are talking literally here about between the 9th and the 10th century of the development within the cortes of a kind of provincial and even interprovincial, sometimes regional, net of a landed business, we can say, even new artisan productions and a new industry, a new market, right? So actually a very varied and functionalized and specialized system that definitely is not the picture of a static world where everything was closed within itself, stagnating with very low growth. This was something very different, and therefore the seigneurial system explains in great part the economical revival of Europe in the previous century, in the following centuries, but at the same time it also shows the survival of a system to the same Carolingian Empire that was incidentally the one that had backed and oriented it, right? But at this point, the Carolingian Empire falls, but something else remains out of it. And sometimes it's literally the same people, it's really the same system. It's just that it faces this moment of major, I don't even know how to say that, destructuration, let's say, of decoordination in part, that is also maybe not so correct to stress as such. I mean, there was an evident connection at all times. We like to enforce the political fragmentation. Yes, it's true, but we often think about it as if every 20 kilometers there was a seigneury, and then that stopped. It was something else, and these were all different worlds. As a matter of fact, these systems were all integrated. There weren't boundaries as such. It's just that single seigneuries had kind of that scale of territorial control on average. Then there were larger powers that functioned exactly in the same way, that were larger, and they were all fluid in this regard. So we can't now in a social history video start talking now about all the political events that brought to that and why that was the case. But this is the point. Don't be fooled by, let's say, let's observe the objective weakness that this system showed, especially in the face of the second invasions that took advantage of a system that had to look weak from the outside, right? The second invasion, I'm convinced of this, the second invasions happened not because they were the active perpetrators of the destruction, but because the system was decomposing by itself, right? So that's where all these martyrs and come from, because historically speaking, it always happens like that. The point is that at the same time there is a connective tissue of Europe during this century that is really amazing, and that is what will essentially emerge up to today fundamentally as a system of European interconnection that was based initially in exactly on this system, on the seigneurial system as such. And we could expand on it, but maybe we'll do it another time. I think it's very important to emphasize it. And yeah, so this is more or less what I wanted to say today. And we will definitely keep talking about this. We're exhausting them a little bit. I mean, but there are always many shades we can discuss about the seigneurials. We didn't even get in the details of, I don't know, single cities, of single seigneuries, certain comital centers, certain, which is very fascinating. And I promise I will do it. I don't know if at one point we'll maybe have to concentrate a little bit in a dedicated way to this, but we'll progressively cover everything. But for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.